Third panel now for Sarah.
Hi.
Alexis, our executive director. Ladies and gentlemen, we're starting our third panel of the day, and really happy to have the panel that we've got. We have one panel change. Oksana Markarova, the Ministry of Finance, has been asked to go to meetings with the International Monetary Fund, with the President of Ukraine. We took a vote. We thought that was a good enough reason for her not to show up, and we let her go. So what we're going to talk today is, and I want this panel sort of to be a synthesis in some way of the previous panels that we had today on climate change and renewables, and on the impact of IT and digital on personal security, and we had some really interesting discussions on investment in AI, NLP, and those kinds of things. We've got a very eclectic and fascinating group with us today. To my immediate left is Sarah Kunst, who's the Managing Director of Clio Capital and a Senior Advisor to Bumble and a contributing editor to Marie Claire. Sarah will tell us more about what she does, but she invests in some very, very cool areas in California. It's San Francisco, yeah?
San Francisco,
San
New York.
Francisco. So she's come a long way to do this, for which we are very, very grateful. Then there's Johan Elias, a Swedish UK businessman who is head of the Head Group, head of the major sporting goods manufacturer, who has taken the plunge into Ukraine and building a plant in Vinnytsia. Johan also has the distinction of owning 5 million acres of rainforest in Brazil, I think, yeah? Which he bought in order to preserve. As I understand, the native people are allowed to run the preserve, and poachers who come in rarely come out. So it's a very market-oriented kind of an enterprise.
That is correct, and it works.
And I was going to say, it's very effective. There could be some lessons here for Brexit, which we'll get to as well. Johan actually was also, although he's a member of the, and a senior member of the Conservative Party in the UK, was Gordon Brown's, the Labour Prime Minister's special representative for climate change, as I recall. So very committed to this area, and we will definitely explore that area for its investment potential. And then my friend Nick Timoshuk, who is the CEO of UFuture, our sponsor of today's panel. Thank you very much, Nick. UFuture is a family office, essentially, organization in Ukraine, and investing in some unbelievably cool areas, some of them in the renewables, also building a city within a city in Kiev. It's called Unit City, which is one of the most interesting developments, and Nick will tell us more about that. I want to try to put today's discussion and the themes that I want to explore, and instead of talking about it at length, I just want to roll a very short video that we at Ukraine Invest have produced. I should introduce myself for the people that are joining us on the live stream. I'm Daniel Bilak. I'm the chairman of Ukraine Invest, the Ukrainian government's investment promotion office, and I'm the Prime Minister's chief advisor on investments. And what we want to accomplish through all of these panels, and I think we want to wrap up in today's third panel, is to give all of you who are watching an understanding of where Ukraine is in terms of the global trends, that it is relevant. It is relevant not just in its contribution, not just in the impact that the outside world has on Ukraine, but also highly relevant in terms of the contributions that Ukraine makes to these global trends. Olesa, can you send the roll the video very quickly?
Ukraine Now, innovation and opportunity. The purpose of this investor briefing is to give you a clear picture of opportunities in Ukraine now. With 45 million people, Ukraine represents one of the largest emerging markets in Europe. Ukraine is transformation. According to the World Bank, since 2010, Ukraine has done more to improve its business climate than any post-communist country in Europe. Ukraine continues to adopt thousands of EU standards yearly as it continues its integration into European institutions. Ukraine's greatest assets are its brains and grains. The nation has a long history of innovation, including the design, development, and manufacture of the world's largest aircraft. In 2017, Bloomberg ranked Ukraine as one of the world's most innovative countries. Ukraine is known for its highly skilled technicians and R&D. Global players are already harnessing Ukrainian innovation in aerospace, science, technology, robotics, artificial intelligence, and IT. Ukraine is the Silicon Step of Europe. In just 5 years, the IT industry has grown from the size of a postage stamp to become the nation's third largest export and one of the world's most important outsourcing centers. Innovation technology informs all of Ukraine's sectors of opportunity. Key sector opportunities include manufacturing, agri-food, energy, infrastructure, and creative industries. With over 30% of all arable land in Europe, Ukraine will continue to be a major player in securing the world's food supply. The country is approaching energy self-sufficiency. Indeed, with one of the world's most favorable green tariffs, solar, wind, and other alternate energy investors are flocking in to take advantage of the opportunities offered by Ukraine's renewable energy sector. Kyiv is no more than 3 hours flying time from almost all European capitals, making it an ideal logistics and transport hub. Ukraine is literally buzzing with innovation and opportunity. Visit Ukraine now by starting at ukraineinvest.com. Ukraine Invest is your investment opportunity partner. Welcome to Ukraine. Вітаємо!
So our Ukraine Now is actually the logo, the slogan that the government has adopted, that other parts of civil society and private sector have also started to promote. We have actually bags, pins with this on the way out. Olesa, you can see it from here. So feel free to help yourself. But the takeaway from this is, and I use this line all the time with investors. In fact, it's the only thing they usually remember from my presentations, and that's that our greatest assets are brains and grains. And you know, I firmly believe, and the discussions I've had with investors is that this is in fact what investors are looking for everywhere. Grains being a metaphor, it's because what we have, but what is your comparative advantage? So when you look when they're looking in different countries, they're looking for first and foremost quality of the people, which is actually the hardest commodity, I'm told, to discover. And then what is the comparative advantage in that country? And what we want to discuss today is where do you see, as international investors, where do you see these opportunities arising? And what are the trends in this? I mean, FDI global FDI seems to be falling. 23% in 2017 over what was almost 1.3 trillion, 1.4 trillion in 2016 before that. And FDI flows seem to be falling in developed countries and increasing in developing countries. And the sense is, I was reading an article that it's really policies. You know, one of the reasons for the drop in the outflows was President Trump's tax policy, which forced or persuaded a lot of companies to repatriate their investment money back into the United States. I don't know if that's made America great again just yet, but you know, maybe we'll get some benefit from that worldwide down the road. And so I wanted to explore this. Is this sort of, Johan? Let's start with you. I mean, you're the most experienced investor here. You invest all over the world. What is it that you look for when you enter a country?
Well, brains, definitely, very important ingredient. But
just hold the mic a bit closer.
Yes. What I would say today, what is clearly very important is that the country has good trade agreements, access to skilled people, and also workers at reasonable cost, good infrastructure, and of course political stability. Now Ukraine is unique because, and it also paradox, because people think Ukraine is not so stable because of the troubles with Russia. But if you think about it, it's more of a Mexican standoff between the West and the Kremlin. And nothing is going to happen in that mix. And it does have the benefit that at the moment, sorry to say this, but it's cheap. It's a good deal to come to Ukraine.
Competitively priced.
Competitively priced. Another way of expressing it. So that is why I decided to make a major investment in Ukraine for building factories. Because if you go to places like China or other destinations in Eastern Europe, what's happened here is that the labor rates have gone up so much, and with continued automatization, those locations today, manufacturing destinations, are no longer competitive. I'm going to China, forget that. You're much better off going to most places, even in Western Europe. If you go to the Czech Republic, first of all, it's very difficult to find workers. And most of them are today Western Ukrainians. And that's another phenomena. So, in Western Ukraine, it's actually not so easy to find people. And if you go to the Czech Republic or Poland, it's actually very difficult to find native workers. There's a lot of Ukrainians. And if you go to the UK or France, who do you find there? Polish people, Czech people. So you have this strange migration. And that is a phenomena that is very likely to continue. And I hope, in the case of Britain, although we have Brexit, that won't put an end to Britain's openness to receive people.
I mean, and it's interesting that it appears that one of the first, if not the first country that Britain wants to conclude a free trade agreement with after Brexit is Ukraine, because they want to use the new EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, which has really brought integrated the Ukrainian economy into the EU economy as a template. I think Ukraine would like to renegotiate a number of those provisions, quite frankly. So it might not be quite a change the names on the document, but that would be a very interesting development.
Well, speaking about that, we have, as of yesterday, about 62 trade agreements lined up, should we need to after Brexit. And Ukraine is, as you pointed out correctly, that's one of our real priorities to get that done as quickly as possible.
Yeah, so we may be the primary beneficiary of Brexit. We'll see. And I want to come back to something you said about the labor and the pools, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Sarah, I would like you, because I couldn't do it justice to it. I would give us just a brief overview of what you invest in and how you got into this, because it's actually really fascinating.
I agree. I do early stage opportunistic investing, and so that means kind of everything that is a C Corp and is tech adjacent or tech enabled. So I've invested in everything from tensor processing units and super tiny satellites to breast milk. And so it's a really, really, really wide range. But mostly my focus has been a mix of startup investing and then also running startups. I've was in venture capital, and then I was not, and I ran a company, and then that company ran out of money, and those who can't do invest, and so now I'm an investor again. And so I do venture investing now. I also have sort of ended up, I've spent a lot of time in New York, and so I ended up as a contributing editor at Marie Claire magazine, where I help them focus on women in business and finance and tech. And then I also am an advisor to a lot of startups, including Bumble, which is a very popular dating app that's hopefully also popular in the Ukraine.
I don't know. First time I heard of it, but then I'm married, so
So keep it that way.
But you have a very specific focus. You focus on startups that are run by women, not exclusively, but this is a particular area that you're focusing on. Tell us about that.
So think of women as like the Ukraine, right? An undervalued asset that people just don't invest in enough. But
That's
really,
the quote of the day.
but
Rupert, get that. It's quote of the day.
But it's really true, right? So you have these women. You have half the population who are brilliant and well connected, and they're well educated, and they're starting companies, and then it's kind of crickets, and nobody gives them money. And so while I don't exclusively invest in women, my portfolio is relatively balanced. I do invest in a lot of women, and it's because there's a lot of research that shows that diverse teams tend to perform better. And there's also just a lot of great opportunities out there. And I can often, to your point about being well priced, put money into a company. And I'm probably painfully honest. I tell founders all the time, I think your valuation should be higher, right? Usually if you're a white dude from Stanford or Harvard, I do not need to tell you that. I'm telling you your valuation needs to be lower. But... and they usually get the valuation
the second
they want.
quote of the day.
But what I do when I talk to women and minorities, it often is, and actually immigrant founders as well, often I look at it and I say, you have to price this higher, because otherwise the investors who are used to seeing these sort of Stanford bro companies are going to think there's something wrong with your company, because, if it seems too good to be true, right, the instinct is that it is. And so it's fascinating both the quality of companies that I get into by focusing a lot on women, but also the value that is there as well.
And are you based? You're doing your investment where exclusively in the United States right now, or
Yes.
are you looking further afield?
So I will invest in anything that is a U.S.-based entity. So what a lot of companies do, and this is actually to kind of tie it back to some of the conversation about Ukraine as well, what a lot of companies will do, even if they're based elsewhere, is they'll open a U.S. entity. And that's because venture capitalists in America are so incredibly lazy. We are just the laziest people in the world. And so for us, we really, really, really don't want to jump through any more regulatory hoops. Our lawyers don't like it. Our LPs, the people who give us money, don't like it. Everybody hates it. And it is so much easier for companies to set up a US-based entity, and you don't have to be headquartered there, right? The last thing I want is a high-quality company moving to Silicon Valley where they're just going to bleed money on salary and rent, right? And everybody's going to leave every year, and it's just a disaster, right? So it's not where you're physically based, but having a business presence in the US opens so much more capital. Because people just aren't going to be able to learn enough about Ukrainian law. I'm not going to go retain a new law firm to tell me whether or not something's safe to invest in. I am a lazy investor, but if you are a Delaware C Corp and you're based in the Ukraine and I can wire money to a US bank account, I'm in.
Well, that's interesting. Nick, what does that do for your ambitions to be the first unicorn in the tech sector? I'm just kidding, but I mean, you as part of UFuture, you have arguably one of the most interesting, certainly from my perspective, one of the most interesting projects in the country. You have 25 hectares of a development in the center of the city that you're transforming into a high-tech city. And what are you seeing as both the advantages, the opportunities, and the challenges? What would you say to Sarah?
Well, I would say to Sarah that she should be braced for seeing more startups coming from Ukraine, doing exactly what she expects them, setting up C Corps, maintaining most of their people here in Ukraine, like Batcube does, for instance, and raising global capital. That's the right way to go. So that's what she should expect. But in general, when we're talking about brazen grains, I, as the Ukrainian, have this wish that we stop draining those brains and grains from Ukraine. And to do this, we should invest in value. If we're talking about brains, we should create opportunities for young people to stay in the country and actually realize their dreams in the country. That's what Unit City is about. Yes, it is a great real estate development, 25-hectare development, but eventually this architectural platform...
It's a cluster, basically.
Yeah, it's just a platform for actually jump-starting the Ukrainian innovation ecosystem to help companies, startups, corporates meet each other, do businesses together, and then go and raise capital from investors in the US or elsewhere. And a couple of years ago, we would say that we would never go into venture investment or IT because we don't understand anything. We come from real estate, we invest in something tangible. But we've already done that. We've opened several acceleration platforms at Unit City. We have become investors in several IT companies. So technology is one thing to watch in Ukraine, but as much as we are grateful to our skilled, talented people for making Ukraine #1 exporter of IT services in Central and Eastern Europe, we want this country to become #1 product company when it comes to technology and innovation, not only in Eastern Europe, but in the world. And we definitely can do that.
Your point about the drain is very important. It comes back to what you were talking about the depopulation of certain parts of Eastern Europe, within Eastern Europe and beyond. And we've certainly, in the work that we do with investors, we've seen this. It's an issue. Part of the issue is that we've had a significant investment in the automobile parts manufacturing sector. It's largely cabling, low-tech, et cetera, highly competitive wage-wise with a very high degree of capability on the part of the workers, well-educated. The problem is that they come for the depressed wages, the investors, and then our people leave to go to Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, because the wages are higher, because their people have gone to Germany and the UK. And on the one hand, this is difficult. On the other hand, what makes this interesting is for us this year in 2018, because we worked very hard to solve the problems of investors in 2017, unlocking almost $1 billion of investment. But Ukraine has now become part of the regional map for investors. We are now being asked to bid with Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia on the kind of investments. Even your investment, we were up against four other countries at that time. It was very interesting. And I guess the question then becomes, Johan, how do we start to raise that bar in terms of keeping the people in country? In the IT sector, we produce 130,000 engineers a year, most of whom we've actually been able to keep because we give them very good tax breaks. But for the workers that we need highly skilled, vocationally trained, etc. What's the secret sauce from your standpoint, what you've seen in other places to get these people to less migration?
Education, 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 and of course providing a good infrastructure for entrepreneurs. I think the fact also that you're not part of the EU makes you attractive. And I shouldn't be
Spoken
saying
like
that
a
as
true citizen
true
of the
European.
UK.
Yes, I'm also Swedish. But the fact of the matter that you're not part of the EU and you're unlikely to be part of the EU in the foreseeable future, I think is good, because you will be able to set your own course, and you have the brains and the capacity to actually do that. And therefore, I think Ukraine is unique in the sense that you do have an interesting future.
What are the kind of investments you're making in other places, and what do your, in terms of the value that you're seeking to get back?
Well, it's two types of investments. I mean, buying companies, making strategic investments again in companies. But when it comes to manufacturing, it's very different investing. You look at, first of all, payback periods that are usually much shorter than you have with a corporate acquisition. You look at things much more from a logistical standpoint. Are you close to main markets? Do you have good infrastructure? Do you have access to energy at affordable or at good cost, low price? So there are many other factors than you buy a company where you look at cash flows and value for money. So manufacturing, you have to take a long-term view. You have to, you really have to analyze things. Take your time. It's not something you do overnight. You compare with lots of other locations. It's a process.
And where do you see the trends? I mean, I was shocked today to read that in the FT that Sir James Dyson is moving his headquarters to Singapore. It probably, from a business standpoint, it's a brilliant move because he does most of his manufacturing there. But you know, he is viewed as a staunch British nationalist, and you know, it just shows maybe that you know you can be a staunch nationalist but a global investor.
I was also surprised to see that, and I don't know why. And yes, he's closer to his markets. Maybe he's fallen in love with the Far East. I don't know. But still, I believe that you should always be close to where your activities are, where you have access to the best people.
Sarah, what are the trends that you see at this stage in IT? We had a very interesting, in terms of the sectors. We had a very interesting panel right before this one. We were talking about personal data privacy in the digital age, personal data security, and we got into inevitably big discussions on cybersecurity and AI and NLP, the natural learning process, etc. What do you see as the trends, and how are you going to capture the value as a startup investor? You got to be ahead of the curve, right?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the interesting trends, and this sounds less sexy, but I think it's still really relevant, is that the future sort of arrived but unevenly, right? And so you take for granted. I was pleasantly surprised to hear that there was Uber here, then I was horrified to see the prices. But
Switzerland.
Hamburger's only 80 Swiss francs. I mean, what do you worry about?
It is wildly affordable. And so, but you know, when you look at those things, right? So Uber is here, great. I was an investor in a company that was actually based out of Spain that was using blockchain to basically create like a PayPal or Venmo for everybody, because people in this room, right? We could all go out to dinner after this. U.S., Sweden, Ukraine, we wouldn't be able to just split the bill without using credit cards, right? And that's so mind-blowing to me as an American, because there's a trillion different apps competing for my attention that let me and my friends split the bills 1,000 different ways, right? And so it was so interesting to think about that. And so those are the kinds of things that I think are low-hanging fruit. Rocket Internet in Europe has done this incredibly well. You don't always have to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes you just, you know, localize it. And I think that that's a huge trend for countries like Ukraine, where if there is not a strong tech ecosystem already, it can be hard to, even though you have brilliant engineers, it can be hard for them to know how to hit the ground running to start some brand new, never before existed tech company. But you say, okay, it's Uber for Ukraine, it's Bumble for Ukraine, it's whatever for Ukraine, and even if those don't turn into these massive successes, if they're like, medium-sized successes, regional successes, whatever, you're working the muscle of learning how to start up, and you're working the muscle of learning how to start a business. I could start a startup literally in an hour at this point. I know exactly where to go for domains, how to incorporate, what services to use. Like, I can just do it in my sleep. I'm raising a venture fund the first time. So within 6 months, I will be able to probably do the same thing with VC funds, right? And so I think the more you exercise those muscles as a country, to your point about brain drain, the more you get people who know how to do those things. In terms of bigger macro trends, kind of to piggyback on your thoughts around privacy, I just have a weird spidey sense. I'm a little bit psychic, I think, that we're going to start to see a shift in social networks. I think that in 5 or 10 years, all of the social networks we use to connect with each other won't be around, and we'll have new things with much more portable data, not necessarily better privacy. I think privacy is sort of a pretend idea at this point when it comes to the internet, which, by the way, if you go ask your Ukrainian grandmas, hey, did you have any privacy growing up in your hometowns? They're probably going to say no. I shared a bedroom with 7 siblings, and everybody in town knew the boy that I kissed.
Oh, you've been to a Ukrainian village, have you?
So to some extent, right, that's just now being replicated online, except like our credit card data gets stolen too. So I do think that there will be some interesting macro shifts, but I also feel like for a lot of emerging countries and emerging economies, there's just a land grab for these really basic kind of block and tackle companies. Go spend a month in America, or maybe not America because we suck right now, but whatever. Go spend a month in at London. London's bad too. Where can you go for a month? China? This is so bad. Okay, the Canadians are always like, what about Canada? Sure, go to Canada. Go to Canada, not in the winter, but spend a month there, right?
Take a canoe trip for a month. I've done that. Yeah.
And see what's going on there, and then think about, hey, how do I bring this home to my market, to my region? And often there's a lot of opportunity there that has not yet begun to be touched.
Nick, what is that? I mean, there's another couple of really good quotable quotes in there, like the memory muscle, exercising the muscle of a startup, because it just shows you how many times you have to repeat the same thing over and over again to actually become good at it. You really do you do a lot of TV, don't you? Unless you're radio, television, interviews or something. You should. I just want to come back on in terms of where trends are going. Okay, so in the trends, we've already identified the tech sector, and you went really big because it's not a real estate play, but it's essentially you're building the physical assets that are infrastructure that Johan was talking about in order to accommodate this kind of a fertile environment, this ecosystem. But you're also doing renewables.
Well, yes. In general, we like to believe that we invest in the future, hence the name. I
hadn't made the connection.
And another, see, I'm trying. You actually
I get there eventually.
You actually also haven't pointed out, as you did in the previous panel, that I'm here not just because we're a sponsor. So.
This is a problem of inviting you to the other panel.
Anyways, so the thing is, on the other hand, I'd like two massive philosophical statements that we invest in the future, in these industries of the future, and we invest in Ukraine's global competitiveness. Meaning that whatever sector, industry, or business can make Ukraine matter in the world more, can plug Ukraine in global value chains, we invest in. Because if we want the world to care about Ukraine, if we want to matter, we must bring value, we must give value, we must be part of those global value chains. IT is one of the sectors, yes, but there are many more. Manufacturing, one of those. We invest in manufacturing, we build industrial parks, and we build manufacturing facilities ourselves, as well as provide industrial real estate platforms for manufacturing companies. We invest in pharmaceuticals and biopharma together with Horizon Capital, our beloved partner. We invest in media. We invest in renewable energy, yes. And last year at Ukraine House in Davos, we still didn't announce it then, but we had a major strategic meeting with Acciona, which is, you may know, a global Spanish energy group and infrastructure group, and we brought them to Ukraine this last year, 2018, and they are our partners in Ukraine. in terms of renewables, I believe that I don't call it alternative, and I forbid my team to call it alternative energy because there is no alternative. And this says the guy who spent a third of his career in oil and gas. So I remember people sitting in global energy conferences, and whenever a renewable guy hit the stage, they went like this, rolling their eyes up. They don't do this anymore. And energy efficiency also, whenever we do the buildings, we literally, for some tenants, we have to walk them through the constructed boxes so that they see the quality of construction we do, which should correspond to the environmental standards that we aspire to, hence the tag and the price for a rental tag for those facilities. So we invest, again, in the industries of the future, which Ukraine has a lot, and in connecting Ukraine into the global value chains. That's what we do.
Terrific, and this is why it was great you were in all three panels. You were sitting in the other two panels because you covered everything I wanted to cover. So it was outstanding. And as you can tell, Nick is not just sitting here because he's sponsoring the panel. That this is one of the premier investors in the country. But and I want to pick up on the last thing you talked about, was environmental standards and the importance of environmental standards, the increasing importance of environmental standards, even as a compliance issue for investing. And Johan, this is really your area, and I'd be interested for you to share, if you don't mind, what you were doing as Gordon Brown's climate change special representative for these issues, and how does this affect your investing, and what are the best places to invest in with respect to these environmental and other social aspects?
So what I was doing was running climate change, which at the time was an interesting period because Bush decided that the US should not be part of the process. So we were the lead negotiators at the time, where there was quite a lot of momentum leading up to the financial crisis. Then, of course, everything changed because governments didn't have money. And in fact, when we got to Copenhagen in 2009, Obama had come in and he had said, together with a number of other nations, that we should pledge 100 billion. Now, in the end, only 10 billion were pledged. And Obama had to rob some sort of expense fund that they had in the White House in order to raise 1 billion, as opposed to 10 billion that they had promised to come up with. So funding for the global agenda is an issue. But thank God, because the rest of the world, I mean, the citizens of the world have woken up to the fact that something needs to be done. And why is that? Because there aren't enough resources for people to live the way we do come 30, 40, 50 years from now. And if we don't do something about that today, and it's not only about CO2 emissions, it's a big part of the puzzle, but it's also adapting our way of living to the available resources and without doing damage to the planet. So you can look at it, there are lots of tipping points in the environment and biodiversity and with everything that we do. And every day we reach a tipping point, and tipping points are like chaos. The only way to unwind it is you have to go all the way back and start again. So we can't do that with everything because it just won't be possible. So we have to stop the pace at which we destroy lots of important things in nature. So we can all be responsible. The way I choose to do that, because I drive cars, they can't all be electrical. I fly planes. You can't fly. We don't have electrical planes, unfortunately. I do lots of things where I emit CO2. But I try to compensate for that, And I do that in a major way because I preserve lots of rainforest. So I'm incredibly carbon friendly, probably the most carbon friendly person on the planet, because with what I do, I actually offset more CO2 than what the UK emits every year. And it's not that difficult. So everybody can do this. And if we all do that, we can make a huge difference. Because if we wait and we try to rely on governments and the United Nations, it won't happen in time.
Very, very interesting, Johan. I would like to actually ask Lena Kazarny to jump in here. Lena is the head of the leading private equity firm in Ukraine, and has had experience. Lena's presence here is a testimony to my good judgment, because I hired her in her first job to deal with Ukraine in 1993. And she's never looked back. I ended up with a government. She ended up in a private equity firm. But Lena, you've been listening to this conversation. What coming out of this, in terms of your experiences in Ukraine and the difficulties or the challenges, let's call them, that you've experienced in actually convincing people to invest in your funds that can't find Ukraine on a map of Ukraine?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you very much, Dan. I appreciate having an opportunity to say something. And thanks a lot for revealing my age. I love that you told everybody that
she was 6.
I came to Ukraine over 25 years ago and have spent 25 years here. But first of all, before I talk about opportunities and challenges, I do want to say that this panel has been truly interesting. And Sarah, Johan, and Nick, this was really amazing. I think that this combination of, I like to say, brains, hands, and grains, and you've touched all of the brains, hands, and grains. I applaud you, Johan, for looking past the headlines and seeing the enormous opportunities that are in Ukraine. We believe in that too. We believe that with Ukraine bordering 4 EU countries and being independent, as you said, and being able to set its own course, it truly is not just booming in terms of the IT sector, but hands, manufacturing, and food and agro as well. So Nick, I liked what you said about higher up the value chain, because that's what we do see now in Ukraine. We do have our first unicorn. We do have with GitLab, a 1.1 billion valuation. So Ukraine has its first unicorn and is predicted to produce many more in the years to come. So for us, we've brought over 40 institutional investors to the country. They have a capital base of 350 billion, and they've backed the funds over, many years, and obviously are long-term investors because they're coming into funds that are 10-year funds. So you've got to believe that the country is on the right trajectory, and you have to believe in the opportunities in the high growth that you see in Ukraine. So I'm happy to say that that's the case. Of course, there are issues. Of course, there's a segment of investors that will never be attracted to Ukraine. They can't look past the headlines. And I think ultimately those investors will come eventually when the herd moves in that direction. And then you have people like Johan, people like Sarah, people like Nick, and his investors, and the opportunities that they're backing, that truly are the taking advantage of a ground floor opportunity. So I applaud you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lena.
Thank you.
Sure, sir.
One thing that I think is a huge, generally on the global stage, we're supposed to be embarrassed about this, but I think it's actually a huge advantage for Ukraine. Americans are geopolitically so incredibly dumb. Like, you're like, the headlines. I'm like, I'm an American. I would never read headlines about another country. Seriously, right? Like, the average American millennial especially, right? I remember, super random, but I remember when I was little, we had a globe in my house. I was born in 86. We had a globe in my house. I was maybe like 5 or 6. No, maybe a little bit older. I don't know what year this would have been. And I remember looking at it, and it says USSR, right? And then we get like a new globe, and it doesn't. I'm like, where's the USSR? Of course, I also thought that Czechoslovakia had an actual earthquake and broke into 2 countries until I was like 20. And I'm smart, right? So point being, Americans, especially American millennials and most venture capitalists in America, are skewing relatively young. Most of our tech billionaires skew relatively young. We have, as a country, a complete allergy to understanding anything about anyone else's countries, right? Which in general is not a great stereotype for us. For you guys, that's amazing. Don't go in and talk about Crimea. We don't know what that is, right? So instead, you go in and you're like, yeah, invest. Here's all the great things. It's just like Estonia. Remember what, Skype or whatever for the case? Yeah, great. Americans will be like, okay, awesome. Cool, I'm in, right? And so use our ignorance to your advantage. Because Sand Hill Road, Silicon Valley, is incredibly far away from Kiev. And that is a huge advantage for you. And then just age-wise, we don't, I mean, I'm sure my parents have thoughts about the USSR, but I'm like, I don't know. It was a thing, right? I saw the wall. And that's it. So use my ignorance, right, to get money.
That's right. And Berlin is a high-tech hub now, not not the dividing line between East and West. A funky place to go for a weekend. Probably not a month, but a weekend will do. Are there any questions, actually? We take a couple of questions
May I
from the
pick
audience.
up on climate change just a little
Oh, I love when you
because-
intro me. Go ahead.
No, because
Please do
that's
it.
important in terms of opportunities. We've studied it recently, and we also look, as Lena mentioned, we're looking into investing in deeper processing of agriculture commodities that are simply being exported now. Now, the thing is, particularly with the European continent, in the nearest decade, because of the changes in the Atlantic streams and extreme weather conditions in Europe, in terms of yields for basic strategic agricultural crops, Ukraine is very, very well positioned and will have much more, will gain even bigger prominence and dominance in the European continent. Now, we should not lose this opportunity into just raising prices for commodities and, and squeezing more into the ports. We should use it in producing high value-added products inside the country, which a lot of multinationals are already doing, but it's just the beginning. Another thing we're seeing in terms of paying for the climate change, we're already paying for the climate change. We own and operate the 2nd biggest airport in Ukraine, aka Zhulani, right? Now, this summer was
Sikorsky Airport.
Kyiv International Sikorsky Airport, aka Zhulani, exactly. Now, this summer was the record all over the world in terms of number of minutes delayed caused by climate, by extreme weather conditions. Actually, starting 2012, number of minutes that caused delay increased 5-fold. So it actually has already very big impact on the business, and unless you invest in it physically in your country, in capturing emissions, in being environmentally sensitive, you're going to lose money very soon. Not like in 10 or 100 years' time. You're going to lose next year.
Well, and I think that's a very, very important point. It was discussed picked up in the earlier discussion with the economic cost of climate change and the need that renewables is not just a desirable place to go to. It's now a necessary thing that we need to do. And if I could just extrapolate from the discussion here, it's that in terms of what it means for Ukraine, it means Ukraine needs to get away from and is getting away from being a raw material source. Whether it's just cereals and the grains themselves, or whether it's even our people, because they're a raw material for in the region. It's that high added value aspect, and I really like what you said, Sarah, about dealing with, and I don't think it's just with Americans. I mean, there are a lot of people in Europe that don't sort of see Ukraine as anything more than something in the news that comes up in a negative context. I think by emphasizing, that's one of the things we've been trying to do at this Ukraine House throughout the day and throughout the week, is that to emphasize Ukraine's full engagement and relevance and contribution to the kinds of global trends that are supposed to make us all healthier, happier, and hopefully live longer. And And I think that the things that you've just talked about are very important, because there's been a tendency, an understandable tendency, and certainly in the last 5 years, because of the external threat that we faced, for Ukrainians to say, you need to help us. Come, talk to me and talk to Ukraine, come in because you need to help us. This is not a winning formula. This is really not something that's going to impress the board of directors or Lena's investors or anyone else. But when you put it the way you've very stark, I couldn't say that, so I'm glad you did, basically said that, all right, I'm in. Tell me how much I can make, aligning ourselves with the criteria that Johan spelt out right at the beginning as to what we're looking for, the political stability, et cetera, et cetera. People say, we have to wait for the political stability, Ukraine to stabilize politically. Frankly, in the Western world, I don't know what that means. I mean, you look around the neighborhood or across the pond, and but the thing is that all of these countries have institutions that function, that are being put under great stress, and we'll see how well they function in each of the countries that are represented on this panel. But I think that this is a really important point to make, is that the instability that's perceived in Ukraine with these elections, there's something actually quite great about the fact we don't know who's going to be elected president of Ukraine in the next.
That's unusual
in the next
these
2
days,
months.
isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, nobody knows. Nobody can say with any certainty. I mean, that should be actually, in one sense, should be celebrated, because unlike our neighbor to the east, we don't know who's going to be elected president. And I think that, with the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, with all the reams of boring documents, et cetera, I mean, but what that teaches, what that tells investors, is that there's regulatory compliance, there's regulatory convergence. That's what we hire lawyers for. And if our lawyers are happy and our accountants can understand your books, which until recently nobody could in Ukraine, then, as you said, we're in. So it's an evolving situation. We're going to have to wrap up. We've got the Klitschko brothers in half an hour with an interview with Andrew Neil from the BBC, and so we have sort of a hard stop in about 3.5 minutes. Are there any questions, like really vital, burning issues? Well, you got to give it to the journalist. Jim, go ahead.
Jim Brook of the Ukraine Business News. I'm very interested in your decision to choose Vinnytsia, Ukraine over China, and I was wondering if you could quickly elaborate on that. Was it shipping costs of shipping ski boots halfway around the planet to where the snow is? Was it the labor rates, which, as you know, in Western Ukraine have gone up? Why Ukraine over China, if you could just get into the specifics?
Incredible foresight about Trump and tariffs.
Well done, Johan.
No. But in a nutshell, it's if you look at Ukrainian labor rates, they are much less than China. And to give you another example, if you're in China today and you have a good property, the authorities may knock on your door and say, you got 2 years to leave. And you say, hey, I own this property. You may think you own this property, but we want you out of here in 2 years' time. That kind of instability means that you can't really plan forward. And that, together with the fact that the cost escalations you have in China makes it uneconomical to be there. So then, where do you go? There aren't that many places to go, because China no longer there, Vietnam, Cambodia, if you look in the Far East. In these places, you don't have sufficient infrastructure, and also finding highly educated people may be a challenge. Then you come to Europe. You look around in Europe. There is Bulgaria, slightly lower wages. You have Turkey, but there you have political issues. And then there is Ukraine. And you don't need to be a rocket scientist to pick Ukraine among the possibilities. It's, as I said earlier, you have political stability, partly due to the fact that it is strategically important, and the Russians, there won't be, I think, escalated conflicts. So political stability, I think we can take as a given. And if we look at the currency development, it's unlikely to change dramatically. And in that scenario, you have, for the next 10 years, Ukraine's got to be the best bet.
Isn't that the second quote of the day?
That's absolutely.
You like that?
Oh yeah, Johan, you can have my job. You don't want my job, but you can have it. That's outstanding. Nick, we're gonna have to wrap up. You as our sponsor, get the last word.
Oh, that was a tough one. Well,
yeah, it's a tough act to follow.
Actually, you know what? Ukraine has been through such a series of unprecedented challenges. The only way we have to go is up, up, and up. And it's only the question of how fast and how big we will grow. So be a part of it.
Well, after the interventions of the last three, I'm not even going to summarize. I don't know. There's nothing left to say. I just I would like all of you to join me in thanking our illustrious panel. And thank you, Nick, for the sponsorship. And we really appreciate the efforts that you made to come here and share your thoughts with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.